you know of a space, don't leave that space vacant. Step into that space. I think for me, seeing that dynamic, I viewed it when I just made the decision to come forward, and I viewed it till today as shlichus.
In this week's episode, Dr. Tara and Yoni Kleshik sit down with Rabbi Avremi Zippel. He is a rabbi in Utah, and we have a trigger warning. There is a lot of adult-like conversation that happens in this episode, as well as talk about molestation. So if you're younger or this is the type of thing that could easily trigger you, we suggest to skip this video and watch one of our other videos. But this conversation is so important, and I wanted to point out that you'll hear from the rabbi him going through this conversation. Obviously, he's tremendously courageous, but it's a very serious topic. But at the same time, he's such a joy to listen to. He's a great rabbi, and he's easily a person who is an inspiration for the nation. And it's one of those situations where it's like, okay, could go on this podcast, go on that podcast. But I hope you enjoy this and learn from this episode as much as I did. Here is the Kleshchiks and Rabbi Zippel.
Mental health, relationships, those are loaded topics and something that affects every part of our lives. But we aren't having enough open conversations about it.
And that's an issue. Welcome back to That's an Issue. We are privileged to have Avremi Zippel here with us today. Welcome
Rabbi Zippel.
Rabbi Avremi Zippel here today.
Thank you, guys. It's an honor to be here. Thanks for having me.
Okay. So we, perhaps tell the audience a little bit about yourself, where you're from, and what you do.
So I come from Salt Lake City.
Where is Salt Lake City?
Where in Salt Lake City?
Where is
Salt Lake City's in Utah. Utah is not in Texas. I feel like I have to make that disclaimer whenever I'm in the frum world. It's it's an experience for me. So you're from Utah, yeah? Utah, Texas? Like, no. First of all, it's not Utah. It's Utah, and it's also not in Texas. But my parents became the Chabad Shluchim to Salt Lake City 30 years ago.
Oh wow!
In 1992, Chabad opened up a state in honor of the Rebbe's 90th birthday, which was in 92. And that state was Utah. My parents got the gig. Very cool. They moved there with me as a little baby. I was raised on the job, and like many kids in that sort of scenario, I decided to move back. It was, the only life I knew on a certain level. And obviously it was totally a decision that I made and ultimately with my wife, but it was the life we knew. It was the life that we wanted. She was raised on shlichus in California.
It's amazing.
And so we moved back. We've been there now since 2014, and it's definitely an interesting experience to serve the community that knew you as a baby, that knew you as a kid. And, it's funny, you guys mentioned about, forgetting the rabbi thing. And it is weird to be the rabbi of the people that, that bought you your third birthday present. Like, now when they see you, it's like, rabbi, like, yes, rabbi. But it's remarkable, I think, for like a lot of shluchim, it's the life you grow up with it. You really kind of, you dream of nothing else but it on a certain level, and you step into it with both feet at the first opportunity that you get.
Yeah, I must say that it's amazing to be able to go anywhere and have people like yourselves in these strategic places to, accommodate, all types of Jews. It's really amazing.
Yeah. We appreciate that. We know, and we appreciate that sentiment. It's I'd say in a community like Salt Lake City, we have a neighboring city in Park City, which is his shlichus is almost exclusively visitors and people who are not locals. I'd say our dynamics are more 70-30 locals to visitors, but it's beautiful to see the achdus that it brings, and people come from out of town, and everyone's got a story how they were stuck in Beijing for Shabbos,
exactly.
They needed kosher food in Shanghai or whatever it is, and it's beautiful, I think, to kind of be at that nexus of bringing people together, and people who otherwise wouldn't be in a Chabad house, who have 100%. That opportunity once in a blue moon, and I think it's a beautiful, beautiful thing.
That's awesome. It's unbelievable that you're able to do that, and we appreciate that.
It's our pleasure.
But there's also we know that there's a story that you have, I think, that's extremely important to discuss. And I think that for some of our listeners that don't know you on that, obviously you have you're an important rabbi that deals with the shlichus and bringing people to understand Judaism and bringing them close, which is amazing. There's also another story that you have, which is equally powerful. maybe we could discuss.
Sure, appreciate that. So I'm the oldest of six. When my parents moved to Salt Lake City, there wasn't much infrastructure in town. Right. We were all homeschooled. And nowadays in Chabad you have online school, and and everyone's figuring it out in a new world. We were hardcore homeschooled. There was a converted bedroom in our house that had desks. My mother was a teacher when she was living here in Crown Heights, and she took that skill on the road and she taught us. But we were at home quite a bit, all of us stacked pretty close together. And so as the family grew, Kanai Nahara, my parents hired help. They hired a babysitter, a caregiver, however you want to put it. Just after my 8th birthday, our family's caregiver began to sexually abuse me.
Whoa.
And it went on for a very long time. To really kind of jump to the end of the story, it went on for just about 10 years. I left home after bar mitzvah. I went to attend cheder here in New Jersey, and then off to a Mesifton, a Beis Medrash outside of Salt Lake City, as one might imagine. And I was coming home for Yamim Tovim and for Simchas and for various reasons throughout the year. And it was continuing when I would come home. And then at some point, the family grew up. Everyone was attending yeshivas and high schools out of state. And so there wasn't that need anymore to have a full-time caregiver at home. And so my parents let her go. Very peaceably and amicably. There was, it was a loving goodbye. And I had done every single day to that point, I had just carried the secret with me and fought with every fiber of my being to make sure that it would stay secret and that no one would find out about it. I committed myself to living in a headspace where that would remain the status quo, forever. I had every good intention, and I think not just good intention, but every concrete plan to take this with me to the grave. This was not a problem for me, right? This was whatever. This was a problem for me in the sense that I had immense shame around it, and I really believed so much of it was my fault. But when I say it wasn't a problem for me, it wasn't something that anybody else was going to help me with. This wasn't something which required outside attention. This required me to... Meaning you were functioning. I thought I was, yeah. And in a certain sense, I think I was overcompensating, I think is kind of the best way to put it. I was using every ounce of energy to excel in yeshiva, to just, push myself through life so that no one would begin to suspect that any of this had happened. And I think the most important thing to consider is that in my mind, the reason no one could know about this is because this was exclusively my fault. This was all my fault. And so I don't know that I was so much sacrificing to protect somebody else. I was sacrificing to protect myself. Right. It was motivated exclusively by a sense of just self-interest and self-protection and almost self-defense. And so that was kind of the plan that I had laid out for the rest of my life, was do a lot of tshuva for all the horrible things that I had done. I did not have a really healthy sense of an impression of self at that point in time, and bury it under 50 feet of whatever to make sure that no one would ever find out. Right. So I think there are two things.
Yeah. Well,
there's a lot in there, but just to one is that you were able to do this, that you're able to talk about this freely is a very, very powerful thing.
Wait, could I jump in
sure.
and ask so what made you come out with the story?
So as it turns out, my life plan didn't go exactly to form. And at a certain point, I think, in plain and simple English, the trauma got too big to handle. And I started showing cracks. So I got married. My wife and I moved on shlichus. We were doing all the things. When I say we over here is unique because my wife had no idea. My wife was introduced to a nice Lubavitcher bacher who the shadchan, pulled a name out of a hat. I mean, in our case, her brother made the shidduch, and we got married and we moved to Utah. We were doing all the things that you do when you're 23 and 24 in Lubavitch. And we had our first kid. And I think for me, when I kind of look back on it chronologically, I think that really was the very large straw that broke the camel's back. I think for me, thinking about fatherhood and thinking about becoming a parent and thinking about becoming a role model for another child, that was, I didn't have it in me to do that. And yeah, I really started just withdrawing into self. I was a shell of myself. And at some point, my wife and my parents were like, something's up. Why don't you go talk to somebody? They had no clue what they were getting me into, what they were getting themselves into. And I agreed to go talk to somebody one time. I wasn't given much of a choice. My parents, my wife were pretty, this isn't a suggestion as much as it's, marching orders. And I went to talk to a therapist one time, and I just to kind of give you a perspective of where I was, I sat down on his couch and I said, look, I'm just going to come out and say this once. I think I may have been sexually abused. For me, it was still couched in such a hypothetical, perhaps maybe like the notion that, a guy can be abused by a woman, by a loving caretaker. There were so many elements to what had happened to me that just didn't jive with how we as a society view that topic.
Right.
And so, for me, it was all a maybe. It was like, well, whatever, like, maybe this happened. And we talked once, and he invited me to come back the next week, and I came back, and I still see him pretty regularly. And that was 2016.
Wow.
So that was 6.5 years ago. But I mean, I had been carrying it since the abuse started in 1999. So I'd been carrying it for 17 years at that point. And it began a very long process. Which ultimately led to reporting, the criminal justice system, and as part of that, coming out publicly and deciding to tell the story in a public format and seeing if and how it could help others, and to where we are today.
Wow, it's incredible. So I think what's important, obviously, of your story is, besides for awareness, but it's also someone might be in you would have been your circumstance. What would you tell somebody right there, right, who's maybe between whatever ages that you were struggling or suffering or a victim, more like you're a victim? What would you tell yourself or a person that's listening to this who knows somebody or is that person? What do you talk? Besides for the intrigue of the story, there's also like practical. That's the point.
I love that question. So whenever I think about that, I think about an episode that happened to me when I was in Beis Medrash. I came, it was the beginning of Elul, where we are now. I came for the first day of Zman, and Yeshiva signed us new roommates at the beginning of every year. And I come into my new room in Yeshiva, and random guy I never met before, and we're all unpacking, and he's putting a whole bunch of stuff, little vials and stuff, in the refrigerator in the room. And I'm thinking to myself, what is going on with this guy? Like, what is this? So I asked him, what are you doing? So he tells me he's a diabetic.
He's the what?
He's a diabetic. He's putting insulin. This was pre-pumps. Like, he's putting his insulin in the fridge. It's got to stay cold. And I freaked out for a second. Like, they put me in a room with a diabetic. Like, am I going to get sick this year? So I turned to him and I said, with all due respect, is diabetes contagious? Like, do I need to be concerned about, you coughing all over me? So he looks at me and he says, diabetes isn't contagious, but stupidity is. Like, which was, I appreciated the sentiment. That was, September was the beginning of the year. In January, my brother was diagnosed with juvenile diabetes. He was 10 years old. And my parents, it was disastrous. And they called me up and I'm like, oh, what do you mean? Diabetes? Not a big deal. My roommate has diabetes. And I can tell you exactly what happens. He gives himself shots and he checks his sugar. And sometimes he steals my nash. He gets low in the middle of the night. It's totally manageable. It's completely manageable. The guy, he sleeps on top of me. We share a bunk bed. And it struck me so powerful how, the huge stigma around issues gets so minimized the minute we have proximity, the minute we know somebody else that's gone through the same thing. So if diabetes could either be this scary monster of the unknown, or it could be something which is completely manageable. And the truth is, both are true. If you don't know anybody else who's got it, then it's, oh my goodness. And if you know somebody else who's got it, it's, okay, this is a situation that needs to be handled, but it's handled. It's manageable. If somebody else was listening to this right now who is in the same situation, I would share with them what I didn't know. And what I wish I knew so many years ago is that there are so many beautiful, incredible, powerful, frum survivors. Boys, girls, men, women who are going on to lead the most amazing lives they could have imagined for themselves, and they are not allowing what happened to them in their past to slow them down or impede them or hold them back from living out their dreams and their hopes to the fullest in any way, shape, or form. I feel what's missing for victims and survivors in the frum community is, does anybody get me? Is anybody out there understand what I'm going through? Like, in general, it's been documented clinically that survivors of child sexual abuse are the loneliest human beings in the world, because at a young age, you're cut off from so much of your natural support system,
Right.
and you're almost taught to have distrust towards all the institutions because you don't know who you can trust with this information, and there's so much isolation involved in that, and I think it goes with you. It really travels with you as you become an adult. It's difficult to know who you can trust. It's difficult to know who you can relate to, and I think what I would share with survivors in the Frum community is, there are so many of us out there, and I mean that in an empowering way. I don't mean that in a cynical way, like it's out of control. It's I mean, we can talk about that as well. But for the survivors who, that line has already been crossed, I think it's so vital for survivors, men and women, to know that there's community, there's togetherness, there's a bond, there's people you can and should connect with, and there's no reason to live in a world and in a space where you operate under the impression that
you're alone.
It's just right. It's dark and bleak all the way through. There's so many of us out there that are leading our best lives, Baruch Hashem.
That's awesome.
And it's important to know that.
And what would you say would be a step to get there? Like, how would a person listening, what would they do practically?
I mean, they should reach out and they can connect. And for me, being public about this and trying to be that available resource for others is such an important part of what I do and something which I believe in so profoundly. But I think that, that's what the survivor could do. I think communally, we can make an effort to really just lift up the voices of survivors. There are survivors in every community. There are survivors in every strain of Yiddishkeit. There are survivors in every shul, in every Beis Medrash, in every kehillah. I think it's a question of whether we're ready to take that step and embrace that reality. And for the young people in our kehillas and for the families that are grappling with that reality, if they find out that this has happened in their own, in their own backyard, for them to know, in this community and just in this Beis Medrash, there are resources. You can talk to this one, you can talk to that one. And, we were chatting off air. We're not talking about speaking to mental health professionals, who are going to diagnose you and hand out labels and prescribe medication and give you books to read.
Right.
You talk to people who share common experiences. You want to know what's going to happen with your kid. You can talk to them because it happened to their kid, and not in a demeaning way. In a way that builds a certain commonality, in a way that builds a certain bond between people, in a way that uplifts, in a way that empowers. I think that instead of, sending people into the darkness and, this happened to you, shashtil, what's going to happen, shidduchim, I'm going to talk about it. There's so much togetherness that we can build in the Frum community. Look, I live in Salt Lake. I don't live in a large Frum community, but Baruch Hashem, with the advent of WhatsApp and all of its cousins, at the click of a button, if my family went through X, Y, and Z, there's a WhatsApp group for it. Like, there's a WhatsApp group for parents of kids who have this and parents who have that and cousins who have this, and it unites people. It empowers people. It breaks that loneliness. I think it's such an important thing we need to be doing inside the Frum community, is connecting people and building people up and not condemning people to that lifetime of loneliness.
That's awesome.
Right. There are support groups.
There are more and more. Look, I came out in 2019, and 3.5 years later, the progress that's been made is gewaldic. It's incredible. And there's support groups, and and whether they're at a higher level of awareness or whether more people know about them or less people know about them, it is becoming more and more prominent, and that's remarkable.
Right. It's a great thing.
It's an incredible thing, and I think it's going to grow. Before I came out, and we talked about shlichus, and I want to touch on that for a moment. Before I came out, I called a Rav. Called a Lubavitcher Rav, and I wanted to know if coming out publicly was the right thing to do. You talk to people, you get all sorts of opinions, but as someone who's a Torah observant Jew, I wanted to get a rabbi's perspective on the record. So I called a Rav, someone who I trusted and still trust profoundly. So he knew my story. I had spoken to him before going to therapy. So I told him, where I was at in life, and I wanted to know if I should come out. So this was in 2018. At that point, I had a 2.5-year-old and a 6-month-old.
Wow. 2
little boys. So he says to me, look, I'm not going to tell you what to do and what not to do. He says, I think it's an important thing you would do if you come out, but I don't know what will happen with your kids' shidduchim one day. So I said, with all due deference, my kids aren't 19 and 17. My kids are 2 and 6 months. And we're talking shidduchim are 20 years from now. So he says to me, yeah, I know. I stand by what I said. And my wife and I were reflecting on this a few weeks ago because, I said to my wife, I said, at this point, if we decided to make shidduchim only from other families that we know that have been affected by child sexual abuse, Baruch Hashem, we have the pick of the litter. And again, I don't mean that in a cynical way, but we've come to know over the years so many other families that have been affected by this that, let's say no one wants to touch us because of what happened, we'll be fine, but I think about that phone call. And I think about that, and again, I think the Rav was well intended, but the stigma that it creates around the issue, if you do this, kol hakavod, but who knows what's going to happen to your family? And instead, the message could be, yeah, you should come forward publicly and you should talk to him and her and them and that family who all share the same. You think about the message that a survivor gets in that moment and how different that reaction is. I think it's worlds apart.
Wow.
Could you tell us a little bit more about the actual abuse, sort of how it started?
So
I guess maybe. I don't know if you remember, but your reaction.
I guess
first
the reason
time,
is not just out of curiosity, but also someone who might be listening might not think that what they're going through is a problem. Or maybe
that's what you were saying before.
Right.
You yourself were confused. What is this?
Totally. So I love how you use the word started. I use the word when I said it began when I was 8. Before I go through the narrative, I'll share a talking point, and a lot of people kind of get uncomfortable when I bring this up, but it's something which I passionately believe in. As parents, as caregivers, as anyone who cares about the well-being of children, I firmly believe there's not a tremendous amount that we can do to protect our kids from coming in contact with someone who wants to do them harm the first time. There's all sorts of people out there who have all sorts of intentions for kids, and we live in a crazy world. We live in a world where our kids are out of the home. They're going to school, they're going to camp, they're going to their friend's house, they're going to shul, they're going to the store. They cross paths with all sorts of people. I'll share a quick anecdote. Before I came out publicly, there were a few family members that I wanted they should hear it from me. They shouldn't see it online, So I called a cousin. I have a cousin who's a Chabad Shliach on a college campus. And I told him what was up. He's very shook up on the phone. He knew me as a kid. So he calls me back 15 minutes later. He says, I just want to let you know, I told my wife, and it rocked our world. And we're on college campus. Our kids have, there's all sorts of babysitters. There's college students coming in to take care of our kids. And I want to let you know, after you told me what you told me, my wife and I called every single caregiver that we have for our kids. We fired them all on the phone because we were so traumatized by what happened between you and your babysitter. We fired all the babysitters. They're all gone. No more babysitters. I was touched by the sentiment, right? It's a beautiful thing to say, and the intention was noble, but let's not kid ourselves. Right. The next story is going to be with the swimming coach, and the next story is going to be a pediatrician, and the next story is going to be a member of the clergy. And what are you going to do? You're going to wrap your kids in bubble wrap and lock them in a closet in your house so they don't have access to any adults.
Right.
So we can't prevent the first awkward incident. What we can prevent as parents is what happens after that. What we absolutely have an area of control over is what happens after that. If we can create the dynamic for the first time our kids are ever in any sort of compromising or awkward encounter, that they can come to us and be like, okay, so I just had this weird thing with an adult and I want to tell you about it because, you've told me to do this. Here I am, right? Mm-hmm. So for me, that's what I didn't have as a kid, and that's not meant to be an indictment of my parents or how they raised me whatsoever, but I didn't have the vocabulary. So the first incident occurred, which was a red flag incident, and it was inappropriate behavior, and it crossed the line, and it was inappropriate touching. And in that moment, I had no idea what to do with myself. I had no idea who to turn to, if to turn to anybody, because most of all, I felt like anybody that I would talk to, I would be compromising myself, and I would be snitching on myself. I'd be getting myself in trouble by saying, look, I did something not sneeze.
Did something wrong, And so, if I say that to my parents, to any other adult, what's going to happen to me? Forget what's going to happen to her. I wasn't concerned about that as much as I was deeply scared of what the consequence would be for me.
Did she tell you, don't tell anyone or any of those kinds of things?
So, such a powerful question. And the answer is no, never. And I think that's what's so misunderstood about this dynamic is that, sexual abuse is a mismanagement of a power dynamic. Sexual abuse, beyond anything, is an adult taking power from a child. In an environment where that is what sets it up for success, the power dynamic is such that the bond really is unspoken. I think
they don't need to use threats.
Exactly.
Right.
You know, and so it was interesting because in my police interview, I had been asked if I had ever been threatened or coerced. Like, you know, they have a list of questions they run through. And I said, no, it's the honest truth. She never, ever said to me, you know, if you tell anybody, you know, I'm going to kill you, I'm going to kill you. Like, God forbid, like, never happened. And so the defense was really excited about that. Like, you know, aha, see, this proves it never happened. And at trial, the prosecutor wanted to ask me about that to explain to the jury that this doesn't happen the way a lot of people think it does.
Yeah, but even if it's not, right? Even just to
I
be
don't
clear for
understand
the
a defense against like
no, but even for the record, right? As I'm not disagreeing with the prosecutor there, but under I think New York law, it's strict liability, which is if an adult is having any sexual contact with under a certain age, you're automatically. It's automatically a crime. There's no consent necessary.
So
I don't understand what the defense
I'll really,
was.
as an attorney, I'll knock your socks off. So we went to trial. Parenthetically, there was a recorded phone call between me and my abuser that happened as part of the police investigation. So there wasn't a lot of wiggle room for the defense to argue, oh, it never happened, because there was some pretty convincing evidence that it happened. You can't argue consent because it's a child. The defense carved out a really narrow window of defense, just a really narrow path to say, look, we're not arguing consent, but what we're arguing is that this was a very sexually aggressive child that put our client in a compromised position, and so anything she did, she didn't have criminal intent. So their defense effectively was mens rea.
Wow.
So
how old was she?
She was 50. I was 8.
It's ridiculous.
There's legislation now that's being proposed to just, you know, prevent that from ever happening again. You know, and I've been on the record since my trial. You know, I went to trial. I had been in therapy at that point for 3.5 years. My family was in court every day. Like, you know, I had a strong support system. There will be a kid who will not have that support system, who's going to go through that at trial, and it's going to wreck them. Right. And what sort of system? The criminal justice system, right? Like, you know, you see the pillars of justice when you walk into the courthouse every day, and it's the pinnacle of democracy, blah, blah, blah. Like, that's what we're doing to people. Like, right. we have a system that allows for someone to make that argument in a courtroom. Really?
It's very intense.
So anyways, they did that. But, you know, going back to your point there, you know, to me, and I think what was so important at trial is that, and in general for me, I feel it's important to share with people is, you know, we think of child sexual abuse of creepy old men and windowless vans and, you know, threats and coercion, when so often, more often than not, it's not that at all. It's a power dynamic where the child doesn't feel like there is space for them to tell. Who are they going to tell? Who's going to believe them? It's their word against, you know, some powerful figure in their life. And so whether it's strictly out of self-preservation or whether it's out of a sense of who's going to listen, you know,
who's going to believe me
against them, it's kids just don't tell because they're self-motivated not to.
Can you perhaps discuss two things? One is you know, how you dealt with the shame that you had to at some point work through that. Right, like how did you do that? And perhaps anyone who's feeling that, how does that person, you know, really deal with that?
When you say work through it, you mean on my own or in therapy?
Either way.
So on my own, it didn't work. On my own, I tried to drown it. I think in plain and simple English.
Right.
I was once on a panel. It was a non-Jewish panel, so I couldn't express myself the way I can express myself here. And so, you know, people were talking about, you know, warning signs that you can pick up on if your kid is going through, you know, something challenging. You know, their grades will be dipping. They'll start to rebel a little bit. They'll be engaged in sort of nefarious behavior. And it was not my turn to speak. And I piped up and I said, I just want to say for the record, my grades went up because of my abuse. You know, we talk about the fact that survivors of child abuse try to drown their sorrows in alcohol. I tried to drown my sorrows in taisvus. I tried to drown my sorrows in more and more pages
religiosity.
of Gemara because like, that'll somehow, help me atone for all of my sins, and B, no one will ever suspect. And the no one will ever suspect bit worked.
Right.
But for me, the drowning my sins in whatever, it didn't, because every blot of Gemara, every extra 30 minutes of Seder, whatever it was, would only make the shame more powerful. The more I tried to, bang it over the head, the stronger it got. There's this incredible kids book that I had as a kid. I think it's still around. I forget which, Yoni and his little lie, but there's
the white lie,
the white lie,
and
the lie that gets bigger and
right.
bigger, and that was my childhood. Right? There's this monster that the more I try to ignore its existence,
that's what fed
the
it.
bigger it gets.
Right.
The bigger it gets. And every morning that you wake up and you're like, good morning, it's Monday, it's a great day, and today I'm not going to think about what happened to me as a kid. There was like, good morning, I'm still here. And not just that, I'm more prominent than I was before you went to bed last night. Like, and on it goes for years.
And how did therapy, what was the process that undid that for you?
So first of all, I wouldn't say it's an is.
I'm sorry.
No, and no reason to apologize. For me, it's an important part of realizing that it's a lifetime journey. We think about the fact that sometimes it's easy to say, it's important to say to people, I believe you, it wasn't your fault. And we feel like we say that almost too many times to victims. You can never say that enough times to a victim. There are not enough times in the world you can say to a survivor of child abuse, I'm sorry this happened to you, it wasn't your fault. Because I can guarantee you, for every time that you want to say that to someone who's been through this, there have been at least 100 times that they've thought that it is their fault. There is never enough undoing that you can do to that reality. It's a slow process. It's a gradual process. Shame is an incredibly pervasive human emotion, and it takes years and years and years of unraveling, piece by piece, day by day. I think for me, the most important mindset to maintain was that this wasn't going to be a short-term, go see a guy for a little bit, take some pills, read some books, you're good to go. For me, one of the most powerful moments in therapy was the end of my first appointment. So I had broken my leg a few years before that.
Right.
And I had knee surgery. And the orthopedic surgeon was a great guy. And I enjoyed my time with him. But no one in the world ever wanted to have a long-term relationship with their orthopedic surgeon. He comes in, he does his thing, sends you to physical therapy, have a nice day. It's a 6-month process at best, 8 months if it's really gnarly. So I finished my first appointment, and I really was not interested in being there. And to his credit, to my therapist's credit, it was far better than I had expected. So we wrap up the first appointment, and I'm sitting there, I said, you know what, doc? This wasn't so bad. How many more times do you plan on seeing me? And effectively what I'm saying to him is at some point you're going to give me a note that says, I determined that Avremi is fit to go back into the regular world. So what's it going to take? Do your worst. How many more times do you want to see me? 5 more times, 10 more times. Can we do this for a couple months? Read a few books? Come on, tell me what it is. So he looks at me and he smiles and says, tell you what, why don't you come back next week and we'll take it from there? Which, was kind of his way of saying it. Don't quite work like that. This is not, you're going to come back next week and see how you feel. And then hopefully you'll come back the week after. And who knows?
It's a journey.
It's a journey. So for me, I think being mindful of the fact that, there's not a thing that I'm going to do to undo the shame. There's so many small things that I do to undo the shame in bits and pieces.
Can you break that down a little bit? What do you mean by that?
So I think for a lot of it, it's an awareness of the fact that I'm struggling with it so much. I think that it's really about building in tools to acknowledge if I'm in a certain environment and all of a sudden the shame is just very overwhelming. One of the helpful tools that I learned through, in the therapeutic process is really to take a step back for a second and be like, wow, okay, hang on. There's a lot of shame in this for me right now. And it's important for me to realize that there's more shame that I feel like a regular person would be grappling with in this environment, in this situation. I need to realize how susceptible I am to the shame. And this is a good time for me to remember that, completely unrelated to what's happening right here and right now, what happened to me as a kid is not my fault. And I've been so predisposed to...
You may just basically able to step back from the feeling and look at it.
And just acknowledge okay, wow, this is a little overwhelming. And it doesn't need to be overwhelming. It really doesn't need to be overwhelming. And I'm sensing things that might not be true, right? I'm sensing that everyone in this situation is upset at me for some reason, and everyone is dumping all their garbage on me for some reason. That might not be the case.
Not believing every emotion that you feel.
And realizing there's a good reason why I'm in that situation. There's a good reason why I find myself so prone to being in that sort of environment. And so, for me, it's, when we talk about grounding techniques in therapy,
right. Do you meditate?
Meditate's a word that's always kind of been interesting for me.
Because what you're describing is something that if someone who meditates like daily, once or twice a day, could do what you're saying much more easily. Like, will have the ability to be able to pull out and just observe their thoughts and feelings versus being in them.
So for me, I don't know why I've always had an interesting relationship with the English word meditate. I think, especially when you come from a background in Chassidus, like, the way just meditation has like an interesting place in that world. But for me, taking things slowly and having the opportunity to step out of a situation, I think a lot of people would call that meditating.
Right.
And sure, let's use that word. But for me, it really is about slowing things down, right? And for me, it's really about developing that skill. And, if there's one thing that I have trained myself to think about through therapy, it's I lived in a certain headspace for 17 years right now. I've been in therapy since the winter of 2016, so 6.5 years. So even if we go day for day, pound for pound, how much I've got 11 years left to really just, kind of balance it out, right? And so I think that the notion of just having awareness,
right? And time,
and really, and I think that's where the idea of self-acceptance comes in. Like I've been through a lot, and that's going to color my thinking about any given situation moving forward. I'm okay with myself, right? I love myself, notwithstanding all of that, and I'm going to develop the tools to think about what that looks like moving forward.
Wow.
Doing the whole trial and all the criminal stuff, did that help?
That's a really large question, for lack of a better term. I know. I had a pretty uniquely traumatizing experience, just given the layout of what happened to me. I think that, interestingly enough, the most important thing that happened for me in that process is I had the ability to learn and to understand that justice really is subjective. And I think it's the greatest gift that I can give to people who are considering, reporting and going into the system, is having an appreciation and an understanding of what you're hoping to accomplish, and to realize how it really is subjective and it's not one size fits all. Look, my abuser is doing 25 to life right now, and she's 73 years old. And so she likely will never see the light of day again. And that's not the best thing that happened to me in this process. The best thing that happened to me in this process is that I felt like I had the ability to fight for myself, to really, defend myself, which was something which had been taken from me so long before that as a child. Given when it happened and given how it happened, I had felt for the longest time I didn't have the ability to fight for myself. That had been taken from me, and I regained that power through the system. I sat in that chair. I pointed my finger at the woman who I'm describing today. Right. I testified. I looked them all down, and I made it through the other side. And I remember my prosecutor saying to me very, very early on, she said, there will come a moment in this process where you will feel like you got everything you came for, and that might happen long before a jury walks back into the courtroom. And for me, I felt that. Wow. I felt like the trial for me gave me a sense of justice, and I felt that before the verdict came down. And so, I think that, and that's what I try to share with people is,
do you encourage other people to report?
I do.
You do?
I do. I don't necessarily encourage them if it's not right for them to do the whole, to come forward publicly. And for me, coming forward publicly was a mixture of a number of things. A lot of it had to do with the criminal justice system. My abuser was arrested on a suspicion of 130 counts of sexual abuse of a child. It was a high profile case before my identity was attached to it. And so there was a strong sense of concern that at some point my identity would leak. And, at that point, the thinking was, you may as well tell the story on your own terms instead of playing catch up to the story. So I came forward publicly, you know, I told my story in the local paper, like, and that, I don't know if that's, you know, the right path for a lot of people. But reporting, I think, is the right way to go. I think reporting is absolutely the right way to go. And I say that unqualified, you know, and a lot of people are like, well, always? Yeah, always.
Right.
You know, always.
We have to protect other people.
Yeah, like, you know, it is always the right thing to do.
No, it's just the question is, like, if reporting may be so damaging to the victim because of all the disbelief and all the negativity that's going to come with it.
Right? Do you think
like that's when it gets so hard? Like,
is the
objectively,
value
of course,
right.
but then as a chas shalom, like let's say as a parent. Like no one wants to watch their kid go through that. So you know what? It's not worth it.
I guess the question is like, is the empowering, and if I'm saying it right, is having that that value of being able to get that power back to defend yourself worth whatever the cost?
I wasn't even asking that. I was asking more like it's sort of your duty to report, right? Because you need to protect other people from this person, right? They shouldn't be walking the streets if they're not getting the proper treatment or if they have to be put away or whatever it is. I wasn't even asking from that point. That's another great question. But it's just a scary thing to think about what comes with it.
Totally. There's I think there are a couple there's a lot of layers there. Why is reporting important? Reporting is important because, you know, a lot of people, I feel like, try to lecture to survivors. It's your duty to report because maybe they're harming other people. Right. I find that very, very detrimental. You know, most survivors are carrying around enough. They don't need all of the hypothetical harm that the person who hurt them could do also on their shoulders. Like, you know, you should report. Don't you? I know plenty. You know, I don't need to carry with me generations of hypothetical harm to make my point. Reporting is important because for me, I think that what reporting set in is that I was the victim of a crime. And I want to elaborate on that for a brief moment. I had always thought I was going to go to the police and I was going to report. And you know, you have two kids fighting on a playground. So, you know, someone comes in and breaks them up and says, you know, you stop and you stop. You know, you're a moron and you're a moron. You go to your corner. And like, I had always thought that was what a police, you know, investigation would feel like. Like, you know, well, okay, here's what we've determined. She did wrong and you did wrong. So like, you know, here's her path moving forward and here's your path moving forward. And, you know, each of you go away. And that's not what it was.
Wow.
For me, reporting was, okay, you have been the victim of a crime. You know, you've been hurt by someone and there was a crime committed to you. I feel like it's worlds apart. And to hear that and to feel that and to get that sentiment was so powerful.
So do you think it's different for a kid? Like, let's say you would have reported this at 10. Is that different?
Probably.
Like, I'm saying let's say it's a parent making a decision with their child versus you as an adult making that decision.
Probably, because I think as a kid, you know, your sense of the world is a little bit different. But I think that as a parent, if that's the dynamic, it's also important for a parent to understand that. You know, your child was victimized.
Sure.
Your child was criminally harmed, you know.
Right, the same way if someone took a knife
and for
stabbed
me,
your child,
that's always the analogy.
You wouldn't say, well, maybe
he's Nebuch and the Rosh Yeshiva said, you
right,
know,
you'd be like,
he tried to kill my kid.
Right. Attempted murder. You wouldn't be like, well, the bus driver just pulled out a knife.
And for me, and so, you know, you're asking about a parent with a child. Whenever thinking about, you know, a child who became an adult, like, you know, should I report this? I don't know if he mugged you. What would you think? You know, if someone walked up to you in an alley in the middle of the night and took your wallet. But you know, it's not so simple. It's very simple. You know, he took my wallet at knife point. It's really quite simple. And so I think that the weight of the situation, you know, for me, and again, I live in Salt Lake. You know, for me, understanding the dynamics of you know, frum communities is always going to be challenging. And whenever this question comes up in conversation with parents, with Rabbanim, you know, about getting authorities involved, for me, it's always the point I come back to. There was a crime done over here. You know, he didn't cheat or lie or steal, you know, or ruined a shidduch or took someone's spot in the yeshiva or even stole money. It's a crime, and you know,
it's
for me,
a crime that it can land you in jail.
Right. It's you know, I'm not sure how, you know, the statutes here in New York. That's a first degree felony. You know, it's a serious crime, and so for me, that's what it comes back to. Yoni, to your question about, you know, is it worth it? Yeah, I feel like for me, there were multiple steps along the way between reporting and deciding to go all the way to trial,
Right.
where I had the ability to pull the plug.
Right.
And so, for me, there was kind of a re-weighing of the situation every time. Like,
Right.
okay, we got this far. Is it worth pushing the envelope a little bit further? Is it worth it? Is it worth it?
And then also worrying about, will the jury believe you?
Right. And so, and at each of those steps, you try to get educated about, okay, so far I've done this. I've exposed myself this much. What does the next step look like? And I think a good cop and a good prosecutor will work with the victim on, explaining to them what they're taking on, with this next big step. But I think reporting is the way to go.
Awesome.
And from there you'll see where things go. But it is the way to go.
Necessary.
And does it become public if somebody if somebody wants to protect their name in the community?
If someone wants to protect themselves, from a journalistic standpoint, most media outlets, whoever it is, have certain ethics, and certain guidelines that they won't expose children who are now adults in those sorts of environments. It's interesting from the police investigation into the prosecutor's office. I had noticed a really kind of subtle change. The cops were like, yes, we can keep this private. And the prosecutor was, we'll do our very best to keep this private, and just kind of acknowledge. And look,
Right.
I came forward the day that I testified in open court. When I testified in open court, there were a whole bunch of strangers sitting in the room. I had no idea who they were, and so anybody could walk in. And there is nothing that prevents, Joe Schmo from walking in with a notebook and telling the whole world about it. That is the reality of the situation. And that's one of the things that did motivate me to come forward. But, and in different jurisdictions, prosecutors will do things differently, and everyone's kind of got their own way of going about it. But it is definitely something to consider. It is absolutely something to consider. And, the reality is, for a lot of people, being public in a very, very extreme way is not so simple. And I'd say it really is a case-by-case basis.
Wow. I just can't, it's hard for me to, imagine if someone's going through something where they may not be able to use the criminal justice system effectively, such as if God forbid it's a parent or a brother or someone a family member that they might know, where it might be even harder to put, to really press charges against someone that you're supposed to also love. That might be.
So that is something which I think is the case more often than not.
Right.
A lot of the survivors that I get to work with now are people who are calling me up and like, look, this happened 20 years ago. So first of all, there's a statute of limitations. So for me, reporting at this point is not really in the cards. But more importantly, what they want to get a sense of is, for me, if this person ends up in jail, not only is that not a win, that's a major loss for me. I don't want to see them suffer. What I want to get a sense of is I want them to know that they've heard me, and I want accountability, and I want acknowledgement. One of the things that I think is, I think about in my own situation is, my abuser is going to be doing a very, very, very long time at the Utah State Prison. And there's one thing that I wish I would have out of this whole story, and that is an apology.
Right.
which I've never gotten. And so, for me personally, I can really understand when all somebody wants is just acknowledgement. I don't want to report. I don't want, to bring all these people into the situation. How can I go to my uncle, my brother, my father, my grandfather and say, look, I need you to understand that I know what you did to me, and I'm in a better place, and I don't bear resentment necessarily, but I need you to acknowledge what happened, and I need you to take a certain sense of ownership, and I want to know that you understand what happened. That is probably the majority of the situations that I get to deal with nowadays, is people in the frum community who are in that sort of dynamic where it's, that they're not looking for blood, and they're not looking for vengeance, and they're not looking for lengthy sentences. They're looking for, I'm sorry. Now that's all.
Right. But a real I'm sorry.
A real I'm sorry. Not like, oh, well, yeah,
right.
I'm sorry, fine. A real understanding of what happened to them. And I think it's something which we tremendously undervalue for survivors. All they want is a little bit of an acknowledgement. And what's so sad is that in so many instances where they look for that acknowledgement, then things just blow up out of control. And, not only do they not get an acknowledgement, that's when the real gaslighting starts. And that's why a lot of people are so hesitant to even bring this up. Forget reporting, even bring it up in a private setting, is because so often when just asked for an apology, everything just blows into a million pieces, and it becomes a reality which survivors don't want in their lives. They've moved on. They really are in a better place. And I think it's something we undervalue in our system. A lot of times I'll have conversations, so if it's a brother and a sister, I'll have a conversation with the parent, and your daughter really wants your son to apologize. Well, why? That's all she's asking. Just a conversation, And what's the next demand? It's not a demand. It was a pretty sincere and I might even add gentle request. Yeah, a very polite one too. And that's all they want. I can't believe that's all she wants. That's all she wants. And I know it's something which I think as a survivor, getting that acknowledgement and that acceptance and that responsibility is life changing.
What happens if they never get it?
A lot of them never do.
Right.
A lot of them never do, and a lot of them end up just really kind of questioning their sanity all the way through because of that.
Right.
And I think one of the things that holds us back from having that, I think one of the things that we're really kind of grappling with in the Frum community is even internally how we think about these situations. I think that a lot of us still fall prey to the mistaken mentality that this sort of thing only happens at the hands of monsters. What sort of people do this? Horrible people do horrible things, when in a lot of times, and I God forbid, don't mean to apologize for this sort of behavior, but in many instances, I know people in the Frum community who have been struggling for years, and it was a brother and a sister, and it happened when he was 14 and she was 10, and it really was misguided. And it really was, sexual exploration. I've heard way too many stories that I want to believe of guys that came back from chassan classes and were like, okay, I can't believe what I just heard. And, went over to their little sister's room and, just kind of get a sense of what they had just, was their first time understanding anatomy and, and sexuality. And they're not horrible people. They're not monsters. And it happened once. That little sister now lives with that for the rest of her life. And that little sister lives with that the same way as someone who's been the survivor of some, serial pedophile has to live with it. And all she wants her brother to say is, look, I'm sorry. I hurt you when we were younger, 20 years ago. And the sister is saying to the brother, I don't think that you're a monster. I don't think that you're a horrible human being who needs to do 15 years at state prison. I know that you were misguided. I know that you were, in many times a survivor of violence yourself and really just kind of passing on the cyclical pain. Just say you're sorry. Just realize that. Just acknowledge that. No one's calling for your head. No one's calling for your job. No one's trying to ruin your kid's shidduchim one day. You just need to understand that your actions have consequences.
Right.
Your actions have weight. Misguided or not, the survivor goes through the same thing. And I think that if we can come to terms with that it happened accidentally, it happened once, it was misguided, it was misunderstood, he had been abused by his Rebbe and 5 years later he passed it on. Those are all excellent justifications. Let's get an apology. Let's get, an acknowledgement. Let's get him to therapy. Let's get him some help. And we'll all move on from this. And I think we're figuring out what that looks like.
Wow. Thank you for sharing your story.
We really appreciate it.
I appreciate that. I'll wrap it up with this. You talked about being a shliach. I think that I mentioned that when coming forward, some of it was motivated by the logistics around the system. But when I was really wrestling with the idea of coming forward, one of the things that I wanted to get a sense of, there's got to be someone out there that I could talk to. Like, who are the Frum male survivors that are still within the community that I can, kind of take their temperature on the whole thing.
Right.
One night I sat down and I Googled it. I couldn't find anybody. Like high and low. Google was like, I'm sorry. Do you want to switch around the keywords? And it occurred to me, at that point, there was no one that I possibly knew of, that Google knew of. And I think for me, being a Lubavitcher, when we think about shlichus, what does it mean for someone to be a shliach? I think the Rebbe taught us that if you are a guy in Kollel and you're 24 years old and you're living in Crown Heights and you learn about the plight or the needs of the Jews in Zambia. So 2 days ago, a new couple announced they're moving to Zambia in the middle of Africa. He's from the Golan in Eretz Yisrael. She's from Alaska, and they're moving to Zambia. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it. I'm probably not even pronouncing that right. It's Zambia. You get the idea. They're moving to the middle of nowhere. Why? Who? What? Why would they do that? The Rebbe taught us to view the world in a way that if you are from the Golan and you're from Alaska and you know that there's Yidden in Zambia who need Yiddishkeit, and you know of a void, don't, you're like, oh, well, that's unfortunate. Step into that void. If you know of a place that can use service, if you've learned of that service, take that as a sign from on high that service is calling your name. That's shlichus. You know of a space. Don't leave that space vacant. Step into that space. I think for me, seeing that dynamic, I viewed it when I just made the decision to come forward, and I viewed it till today as shlichus. You know, awesome. you learn about a void, you learn about a space in a community that is not being filled. Fill that space. So, you don't have to move necessarily. You don't have to, leave your other shlichus. But if there is a space in the community that needs attention, and it needs TLC, and it needs, awesome. it needs a filling. Shlichus means fill a space. You see a space in the world, it's not just there for you to wonder about, it's for you to feel a calling. And for me, that's shlichus.
Amazing.
Is there a contact? I don't know if you want people contacting you, but...
Absolutely. Best way, I'm happy to give out my cell. Best ways on social media. It's at Utah Rabbi across the variety of platforms.
Utah Rabbi.
All the big ones. Instagram, Twitter, LinkedIn. I'm staying away from TikTok. I hear it's a rabbit hole that once you go down, you can't come back up. And but I for me, the most fulfilling thing that you can do in shlichus is having more work to be done. And so, if people want to be in touch, questions, comments, concerns, or criticisms, I encourage everyone to reach out.
Wow, amazing!
Definitely one of my favorite episodes so far. Tremendous, really tremendous. It's one of the episodes that I personally feel so good about being a part of this mission to give someone like him a platform to speak about his experiences is I feel lucky, and again, kudos to him for coming on our show, and this is not the first public place that he's been talking about it. He's been talking about it for a lot of people, and we need more courage like Rabbi Zippel in the world. And if you or someone you know is going through some challenging times or need some mental health help, you could call our friends at Relief Help. You can go on their website, reliefhelp.org. That number is 718-431-9501, or you can send them an email, info@reliefhelp.org. If you enjoy this episode, please go ahead and share it with someone that would feel that they would find it helpful, insightful, or help give them hope. Until next time, stay safe. Living L'chaim.